Last week, NATO agreed to a new 5% target. And while this was generally framed as a necessary remedy to the threat from Russia and decades of underinvestment in Europe's militaries, when you dig into the numbers, it's hard to see how most European countries can really afford it. So in this video, we're going to explain why Europe can't really afford 5%, why this makes further joint borrowing at the EU level more likely, and why history shows that further joint borrowing could well be the first step on the way to a federal EU. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's start by taking a look at NATO's new 5% target. Technically speaking, the new target is split into two components. 3.5% of GDP is to be spent on core defence capabilities, and another 1.5% of GDP on quote-unquote security, broadly defined, with these targets to be met by 2035. For context, in most European NATO countries, defence expenditure currently sits at about 2% of GDP, and total government spending accounts for between 40 and 50% of GDP. This means that countries will have to increase defence/security spending by about 2% of GDP over the next 10 years, representing roughly a 5% increase in overall government spending. A 5% increase in government spending might not sound like much, but most European NATO members will struggle to afford it. Many European budgets are already under strain, as evidenced by the fact that most European countries are running sizable budget deficits on top of large outstanding debt burdens. Ultimately, this means that most European governments won't be able to borrow their way to the 5% target. Some politicians and commentators hope that military spending will essentially pay for itself by boosting research and development spending, which will eventually lead to productivity increases in the wider economy. But this feels somewhat optimistic, given that productivity levels have been stagnant in most developed countries since 2008. If this doesn't happen, increases in defense spending will have to be funded by either raising taxes or cutting spending elsewhere. But European governments already have the highest tax burdens in the world, which again are expected to rise as populations age. Spending cuts don't look too attractive either. European countries are also scarred by their experience with austerity during the Eurozone crisis in the 2010s, which stunted growth and provided fertile political ground for anti-establishment parties. In countries like France and the UK, the electorate even reacted furiously to shallow spending cuts, and few, if any, European governments have laid the political groundwork for cuts like this. Presumably because it doesn't have to be met until 2035, politicians haven't really warned their electorates that this 5% target will eventually require higher taxes or spending cuts. Instead, they've just blindly signed up to it, done a whole load of triumphant photo ops, and left a fiscal time bomb down the tracks for their successors. This is why there's a pretty widespread suspicion that this target won't actually be met, and that it's something NATO's just signed up to temporarily appease Trump, with the ultimate intention of giving up on it once Trump leaves office. And it's already sort of falling apart. Spain successfully carved out an exemption, and Slovakia has asked for a similar deal. But if Europe actually sticks to the target, then this could very well pave the way for a massive increase in joint EU borrowing. And that's because this is the only other way for the EU to fund significant spending increases. And it's actually more cost effective than doing it at the national level, because the EU can borrow at lower rates than the vast majority of its member states. The Commission has already taken a step in this direction with the Rearm Europe programme, which aims to issue €150 billion worth of new joint debt to help fund Europe's defence build-up. And it's something that Emmanuel Macron and the EU's top diplomat have been calling for a while now, only to be stonewalled by more fiscally conservative member states. But this was before the new 5% target, when most European countries thought that rebuilding their national defences meant pushing defence spending slightly above 2% of GDP to maybe 3% at a maximum. Furthermore, the so-called Frugal Four, Denmark, Sweden, Austria and the Netherlands, the 4 EU member states that have been historically the most staunch opponents of joint borrowing, don't really exist anymore. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen explicitly disavowed the group last month, when she said that she'd support an increase in EU borrowing to fund Europe's defence build-up. Austria is also mired in a brutal economic crisis, now entering its third year of recession, which means that it won't be able to fund significant increases in defence spending without European help. Sweden will also be more open to joint EU borrowing if it's spent on defence, given that it's one of Europe's biggest defence exporters. And that just leaves the Netherlands, and given their domestic political dysfunction, they'll probably struggle to mount a challenge by themselves. Senior finance ministry officials from Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands also all attended a secret gathering in March to discuss the prospect of creating a supranational bank, specifically for the purpose of joint defence procurement, which suggests that they're open to a fiscal union if it's cost effective. And, well, history suggests that this could well be the first step to a deeper political union. Many of the great federal states we know today were created because some crisis forced some politically weak central authority to step in as a borrower of last resort, with the process of later repaying these debts giving the central authority more political power and eventually paving the way for a federal state. At America's founding in 1776, for instance, the federal government, the then Continental Congress, had no powers of taxation and, like the EU today, relied entirely on contributions from member states. Americans didn't like the idea of a strong central government, but during the War of Independence, the Continental Congress had to step in as a borrower of last resort in order to fund the war effort. And then it had to assume tax-raising powers to pay off these debts, paving the way for a political union. Similarly, before the First World War, Germany was a patchwork of at least semi-independent states, and the Reich, essentially the federal government, had limited tax-raising powers, mostly involving tariffs. The First World War then forced the Reich to step in as a borrower of last resort, and then assume the power of direct taxation in the interwar years. In short, a weak central authority takes on debt during a time of crisis, and then after the crisis, they assume tax-raising powers in order to pay back those debts, which the EU doesn't currently have, and this essentially creates a new unified state. We're not saying that this is definitely going to happen. Rather, the point we're trying to make is that the EU's decision to step in as a borrower of last resort follows a well-worn historical pattern that usually ends in deeper political union. To some extent, this is how the EU has always worked, with successive crises pushing the continent towards the ever closer union originally envisioned by the Treaty of Rome. All of this plays into a broader feeling of chaos in the world at the moment. Whether it's wars, economics, or geopolitics, it feels like things are increasingly uncertain. And who's at the middle of all of that? Well, the United States. At one time, the US seemed to be a steady, stabilizing force in global politics, but it seems that those days are over, with American influence, popularity, and dominance on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we unpack everything from the collapse of democratic norms in the US to the decline of American soft power, and if the US can maintain its dominance in energy and technology. We also discuss the people who could pick up the reins from the US, like if China, Europe, or even a new multipolar order could replace America. This magazine is our longest ever, coming in at 76 pages, and it's full of our very best journalism and well thought through analysis. That goes beyond just the US too, with more than half of the magazine dedicated to other topics, from Germany's new focus on military might, the offshoring of migrants around the world, how Nigel Farage could become Britain's next Prime Minister, or our section where we ask a handful of experts what's really driving anti-establishment sentiment around the world. You can pre-order a copy of Too Long from our website right now, or you can subscribe to make sure that you never miss an issue going forward. And if you do, you'll also get 20% off every copy as long as you're subscribed. Plus, just this week, if you use code AmericanOrder, you'll get an additional 20% off any subscription, bringing down the price to as little as £6.40. So pre-order a copy now to get yourself all of that extra content and support the journalism that we do here at TLDR every single day.